Hello and welcome. Moss Adams is pleased that you've joined us for today's session, 2022 State of the Economy, Shifting Gears. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome and thanks for joining. We're pleased to present our continuing professional education webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session offers 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy requirements. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of polling questions. To participate in the polls, please check the button next to your answer within the slide window and click Submit. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry if you can't download your CPE certificate today. We'll email you a copy in 2 weeks. If attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet, available in our Slide Deck and Handouts widget to receive credit. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. CPE credit can only be awarded to participants registered as themselves and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
All right, and now that we have our housekeeping video out of the way, I would like to turn the floor over to Dustin Birashk, partner here at Moss. Dustin?
Thank you. Happy Thursday, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our final webcast of the year. In reviewing the registration list earlier this morning, I saw we have folks joining us from over 40 states, plus 1 from British Columbia, Canada. Very exciting to have so many folks with us. On behalf of my colleagues at Moss Adams, we are grateful to have our dear friend John Mitchell with us today to share his thoughts and insights on the state of the economy and where we may be headed. John has been making economic presentations across the country for decades, many of them during his time as a professor of economics at Boise State and as chief economist at U.S. Bancorp. Please join me in welcoming John Mitchell.
Thanks, Dustin. It's very nice to be here this morning at an incredibly exciting week. Of course, we had the Fed meet, we got the CPI release, and when they have the events of this morning that I'll mention later. 9 days before Christmas Eve, we look around. Labor markets are still robust, but there are some hints of softening. The Federal Reserve, as we saw yesterday, is still channeling Paul Volcker. Inflation is off the highs, but above its target. Financial market volatility, we see the market down by 2.6% this morning. Lots of volatility. We've got divided government again. The war is approaching its 1-year anniversary. And, there's a process of restructuring going on. The economy is always restructuring, but we have put in place a set of incentives revolving electrification, research, that sort of thing, that may have long-term implications. We'll have to see what its fate will be. And then, I have trouble wrapping my head around the notion that 2 million Taylor Swift tickets were sold in a day. Well, let's talk about output. Okay. Now, the economy started to recover in 2020. We had the 2-month recession. I've got quarterly growth rates of the GDP up here from the fourth quarter. I didn't put the third quarter because that was like a 33% annual rate, and it sort of dwarfs the charts. But you can see output was expanding through 2021. Then we get declines in output in the first quarter, the second quarter of 2022, with a rebound in the third. Well, that got a lot of people excited, but there was a lot of sort of pandemic-related stuff in there. Major swings on the trade side, and changes in inventory. I mean, consumer spending was growing, for example, throughout the period, but you had big swings in trade and inventory. The third quarter, the swings on trade and inventory boosted output. The big drag in the third quarter was residential. Okay, so but basically the economy is continuing to grow. The labor market is fascinating stuff. It took 30 months for us to make up the losses that we had during the downturn. You had tremendous declines in employment in March and April of 2020. Started up in May, and if you look at the graph, you can see employment rose every single month since May of 2020, except for December of 2020, when we had another outbreak of COVID that reduced activity. Then it's continued to rise. November saw an above expectations net gain in wage and salary jobs, 263,000. The unemployment rate, at 3.7%. And one of the unfortunate things about doing things online is you don't really get to see the audience, so I don't know how old you are. But if you think back over the course of your life, if someone talked about an unemployment rate of 3.7%, you'd probably say, gee, that's pretty good. Okay, that's relatively low. November, the participation rate, that's the fraction of the adult population, 60 in the labor force, working or unemployed, 62.1. It was higher than that in February of 2020, the last month before the pandemic. Okay, so it's gone down, and that's been a major element of concern. Okay, labor force went down. The wise Chairman Powell gave a speech about 10 days ago when he talked about this. A lot of it is aging baby boomers reaching retirement and deciding given what was going on with COVID, maybe to leave a little early. But you had baby boomers leaving. Then you had a slowdown in legal immigration. That's probably played a role because immigrants, of course, have a very high participation rate. And as he pointed out, one of the implications of COVID for the labor force was smaller because of the number of excess deaths. The October job openings and labor turnover survey showed a decrease in job openings to 10.3 million. That's still well above the number of people who are unemployed, but it was down from 10.7. Initial unemployment claims, and I don't know what they did this morning, but they come out every Thursday morning. They're up off the lows, okay, but they are low in any long-term sense, and they fell last week. The Beige Book, which comes out from the Federal Reserve, okay, about 2 weeks before the board meets, it's a collection of anecdotes. But one of the things that comes out of that is people are reporting less difficulty in hiring and retention than they were before. We'll have to see if that continues. The excitement this year has obviously been on the inflation front. Okay, We had the November data. Consumer Price Index came out 7.1% year over year. The core, which excludes food and energy, was at 6. But if you look at that graph on the left, you go back to the spring of 2020, and the inflation rate was barely positive during the depths of the downturn. Then began to rise. Remember back then, hotel rates, airfares, gasoline, those kinds of things were plummeting. Then as the economy started to recover, you saw that inflation rate pick up. Then you get into 2021, and it rises dramatically. And the peak on a year-over-year basis in the United States was June, when it was at 9.1%. Then it has been declining to the 7.1 that we saw for November. Now, it's sort of interesting. It's not just a U.S. phenomenon. The November European Union data up 10%, United Kingdom 11.3%, and Turkey 84.4%. So inflation is not just a problem here. But one of the things that's interesting, it's at the top of the public's concern. It impacts, basically impacts everybody. And this time around, the high frequency items, have been very visible. You drive down the street, okay, and you see the gas prices, displayed on every corner. You go to grocery stores, and of course people do that on a frequent basis, and see the continuing increase in food prices, and they were up sharply in yesterday's data. So it's very visible. If you look at the data, plummeting prices of TVs, but you don't see that. You're not buying a TV very often, but there are some prices that are going down. Now, this has not been a big issue for a long time. We look at the last decade. The top line is year-over-year increases in the total CPI. The red line is the core, excluding food and energy. But if you look back at the last decade, notice that you've seen the rate of inflation, running in the 2%, vicinity or below that, particularly when you had volatility on some, energy and other prices. But it's not been a big deal. It's not something that you probably thought about a lot. But then you get past 2020 and into 2021, and you see that dramatic acceleration. It is, a significant jump, and it gets people's attention. Now, in this inflationary environment, I have to come up with these questions, and I was intrigued by what will people's nominal holiday spending be this year compared to last year. Last year was, of course, very, very strong. We have the week numbers came out this morning. Let's see what people are planning to do. Okay, unchanged, up one, predominantly up 24% below last year. It's sort of interesting because going into the Christmas season, you have strong labor markets, rising incomes there, but you've got the weakness and the wealth effect from the declining net worth, and a lot of worries about recession. But it looks like this will probably end up with some upward drift in consumer spending this year through the holiday season, but clearly not the big boost that we saw last year. Well, if you think about this inflation process, and there's a lot of elements involved. Lael Brainerd, who's vice chairperson of the Federal Reserve, gave an interesting speech a week or so ago talking about the pandemic implications. You know, if you think about the shutdowns, the supply chain interruptions, demand shifts, all of those things were induced by the pandemic. Demand shifts, people wanted stuff, they couldn't travel, didn't go out to eat, but they wanted Pelotons, bicycles, kayaks, etc. And then she talked about the notion of supply elasticity. Now, if you spend time teaching economics, you have this desperate hope that somebody remembers something from their economics class. And I'm assuming most people on this call, had it. Well, remember price elasticity, the sensitivity of the quantity demanded to changes in price. Some things are very responsive, others are not. Well, supply elasticity, we're talking about the sensitivity of supply to changes in price. Now, normally, when you see, as we did during the pandemic, the price of used cars go up very rapidly. In some cases, used cars were higher than the cost of the new car. Well, what would you expect to see happen? Well, clearly increased car production, but you couldn't do it because you couldn't get chips. I mean, the ability of the system to supply was reduced. So it's an interesting way of looking at it. Then, of course, you had the global rebound as activity picked up around the planet, putting upward pressure on some prices. Then events like weather and plagues like avian flu killing billions of chickens. The energy shocks as demand picked up pre-war. Then you get to February 24th last year and the invasion. And that impacted energy, food, metals prices. Then, of course, while all this was happening, you had trillions in stimulus. We had the Omnibus COVID Relief Act in December of 2020, obviously the CARES Act during the downturn. Then the American Rescue Plan, $1.9 trillion in March of 2021. Monetary ease by the Federal Reserve, essentially zero interest rates, quantitative easing, buying securities, all this stuff was going on, and you can see a lot of it is going to put pressure on the price level. Now, when you see, inflation soar, the first thing one thinks about is, okay, what's monetary policy? How is it going to respond? Well, at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, in August, when the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City has its annual conference, Chairman Powell spoke. The head of the Fed normally speaks. And if you look at that speech, or I've got a portion of it on this slide, the overarching focus right now is to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal. Price stability is the responsibility of the Federal Reserve and serves as the bedrock of our economy. Without price stability, the economy does not work for anyone. We will not achieve the strong labor market conditions. Well, those of you who have been around a while said that could have been Paul Volcker in October of 1979 when we were running double-digit inflation in the United States, and he basically announced we weren't going to do that anymore. And I've got on the right-hand side some quotations even from yesterday. What did the Fed say? Ongoing increases will be appropriate. Then this next sentence, they had that in the previous release as well in November. The committee will take into account the cumulative tightening of monetary policy and the lags. Because remember, the Fed has raised rates now 7 times. Back on the 2nd of November, in the minutes, a substantial majority of the participants judged that it would be appropriate to slow the pace of the increases, which they did yesterday. And then yesterday they said they are strongly committed to returning inflation to the 2% objective. You know, it's gone down from 9 to 7.1, but the Fed is hanging tough. Now, think about that unwinding. You know, first they slowed down the quantitative easing, they were buying $120 billion a month in securities, treasuries, and mortgage-backed. Now they're letting $95 billion a month roll off, and they reaffirmed that yesterday. $95 billion a month, when they mature, they're not buying. Okay. Somebody else has to fund that. And they've raised the federal funds target. 25, 50, 475s, then a 50 basis point yesterday. So you see the Fed moving. Well, how does it work? The transmission mechanism. You've been through it before. The first thing we would expect to see is interest-sensitive spending, you know, housing, durables that people borrow for, credit card rates, okay, have gone up. Then asset prices. I mean, we saw this big run-up in asset prices during the period of very low interest rates. Well, when that's reversed, those prices are going to go down, and you're seeing that with a vengeance even today. And you'd expect to see some strengthening in the dollar. Okay, now I thought it might be fun to ask, given that you've been through this period with incredibly low interest rates, let's see how many people bought or refinanced during that time period. Okay, we look at that. All right, 42% did buy a house or refinance during that time period. That's sort of interesting because then you ask yourself, if you refinanced during that period or bought a house and you got a mortgage that's 2.75% or something like that, how anxious are you going to be to move? You're going to be potentially locked into that, because if you move, then you take out a new mortgage, and the rate's going to be somewhere between 6 and 7. I mean, it's one of the indicators of how people will be locked in to their house. Okay. Well, one of the interesting things is, you know, look at the weakness in housing. You know, existing home sales from the National Association of Realtors. It's been going down for 9 months. The Case-Shiller Index, the largest deceleration in home prices was in July to August that they had. June to July was the second largest, and it went down again in September. All 20 cities that they track were down. The Fed Financial Stability Report in November, they were very concerned about home values. Okay, affordability going down, first-time buyers going down, permits weakening. And of course, housing was on fire during the, and maybe that's not a good analogy. Housing was very strong during the downturns. People wanted more space. Rates were so low. Millennials moving into the home buying age category. Now, I went through for the when I got the initial list of people on the call and pulled the Federal Housing Finance Agency House Price Index for the third quarter, which just came out about 2 weeks ago, and looked at these are the annual change. For example, Alabama, the same homes over time, purchase only, were up 14.6% over the year. Alabama was ranked 10th. And during the third quarter, prices rose 2.8%. Okay, look at the various states, Arizona, California, Colorado. You can see in the third quarter, while prices were up over the year, they were declining over the quarter. That was common in many states. You saw the weakness start to spill over. Now, these are houses that are sold and the mortgages are purchased by Fannie and Freddie. But you get the idea of some weakening in the housing market, impacting prices. If you look at household net worth, now the Federal Reserve, of course, every quarter puts out an estimate of the net worth of households and nonprofits. In the second quarter, okay, you can look down at that graph, net worth declined by about $6.1 trillion. If you look at what's happened since 2020, the first quarter of 2020, you see net worth went down by $6 trillion. If you remember that, that's right when the pandemic was getting started. But then look what happened. You saw rates go down. The downturn was relatively brief, and then net worth rose from $8 trillion, $4 trillion, $8.5, $5, and so forth. Then you get to 2022. First quarter was down slightly. Second quarter, $6.1 trillion. In the second quarter, financial assets were down $7.7 trillion. Weak bond market, weak stock market, and then I put the S&P as of yesterday was down 15.7% for the year through yesterday, and obviously the day it is yesterday. So it's the day before, and obviously it's gone down more today. On the right-hand side is the savings rate. That's savings as a percentage of disposable income. You saw that spike when the stimmies were sent out, that sort of thing. People couldn't spend, but then the savings rate has been drawn down. Consumer spending is held up. One of the ways that people have held it up is drawing down on that pool of savings left from the downturn. Now, let's talk about fiscal policy. You all remember the CARES Act and the COVID Relief Act, the American Rescue Plan, the Infrastructure Bill, the CHIPS Act this year with over $50 billion in subsidies for semiconductor production, government research. It's a new industrial policy, partly pandemic related, in an effort to have some industries brought here rather than be more dependent on foreign sources. Then, since we did this before, we had the Inflation Reduction Act. Okay, now it's sort of interesting. The Inflation Reduction Act, it's basically a climate bill. All kinds of electric vehicle incentives, tax credits with income and locational requirements for where the stuff's produced, research incentives, tax credits for production of renewables, battery storage systems, nuclear, an effort. This is that restructuring that I was talking about earlier. A beefed up IRS, corporate 15% minimum tax, buybacks, tax on buybacks, extended the pandemic insurance subsidies, allowed Medicare to negotiate some drug prices, basically imposing some price controls with penalties for violation. And then deficit reduction. The Inflation Reduction Act was supposed to bring in $737 billion in revenue, $300 billion to deficit reduction over 10 years. Then after that came the executive action for student loan forgiveness. That's now, of course, in the courts. But the CBO estimates that will add $420 billion to the deficits. So, we've got a lot of fiscal policy out there right now. We don't know, of course, what will happen with the debt forgiveness act. Now, given the attempts to restructure the U.S. economy, I thought it might be fun to ask, what powers your current vehicles? Okay, all gasoline, gas and hybrid, gasoline and electric, hybrid, electric. Well, clearly, there's a long way to go as we move to that towards electric-powered vehicles, with 84% all gasoline and hybrid, gas and electric. That's interesting. But it gives you a sense of how far we've got to go for this to happen, if indeed it does proceed as rapidly as some would like. Well, clearly, when we look back with the inflation environment that we're in, there were some mistakes. There were some mistakes made. And I think, people have really talked about these, and the Fed, I guess, recognized these, missed the tightness of the labor market. We saw the participation rate drop down, and the expectation was that, okay, there were some distortions there, the extra unemployment cop, the virus, but then that would bounce back when this was over, okay? The labor market remains tight. The people did not come back to the same degree that they left, so that was probably a mistake. The Fed, if you'll remember, kept talking about transitory elements on the inflation side, emphasizing that things like the used cars, the chip stuff, this wouldn't last very long. Food price stuff, supply chain distortions. A lot of that was expected to be very short term, and it's taken longer. It's taken longer for those things to resolve themselves. In retrospect, probably should have reacted sooner to the excessive monetary and fiscal stimulus. All that stimulus that was out there. And, granted, the economy was in a deep hole in the spring of 2020, but then it came back and the output recovered by mid-2021. You still had a lot of that stimulus there. and probably should have reacted earlier in retrospect. You know, one has to wonder if people weren't lulled by the long period of inflation being below target. You know, I showed you that 10-year slide, and notice inflation was hanging at the 2% or under vicinity. On August 27th, 2020, Chairman Powell at Jackson Hole introduced the notion of flexible average inflation targeting, such that if inflation had been running below target for a long period, they would tolerate a period of above target inflation. Now, that was talked about, again, in August of 2020. Well, I mean, one might say they've succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Inflation, of course, is well above that, but I think we were lulled by the long period of relatively low inflation to not be as sensitive to its reemergence. If you look through the data now, clearly the Fed shifted gears, 7 rate increases. Those increases are working through the system. You've read a lot lately about inverted yield curves. Short-term rates are above long-term rates. You know, that's a classic recession signal. Supply chains, that's interesting. Supply chains are improving, okay? Supply chains are improving. The cost of shipping boxes, for example, across the Pacific have fallen dramatically. Commodity prices are starting to drop. Used car prices are coming down as increased production of new cars. So things seem to be loosening up a bit. You see that in the anecdotal data. If you look around the world, okay, China, they've got the emergence of the reemergence of COVID, the backing off of from their zero COVID policy, large outbreaks, and you've got weakness in China. In Europe, of course, hammered by the run-up in energy prices, the cutting off from Russian gas, now the attempts to wean off of Russian oil. So you've got weakness there. Some of those countries very likely already in recession. We've still got tight labor markets. With continuing increases in employment. The vacancies have started to come down, but you still see help wanted ads. As many of you travel around, I mean, it's amazing to me the abundance of help wanted signs. You go to the post office to get stamps, and you get a job application. For most of our lives, those were pretty good jobs, but even they're having trouble. This is not something that we've been used to on an extended basis for a long time. The Beige Book describes the economy output as flat to up slightly, clearly weaker than the previous Beige Book. Price increases have slowed. Hiring and retention problems have eased. Okay? Now, consumer spending has held up, perhaps until this morning, as people tapped excess savings, started to use credit cards again. So indeed, it's a mixed picture. Now, I always like to use this job growth update because out of BLS and Arizona State University every month. Here's October data, which is the most recent. Now, what's fascinating is all 50 states are up. Okay, Texas was at the top followed by Florida, Oregon. Mississippi was at the bottom, but all of them were experiencing rising employment on a year-over-year basis. Now, if you look back at other recessions, at the start of recessions, you had some states that were declining, but that's not the environment that we're in at the present time. Now, I went through with the states that I was told were going to be on and pulled the October data. Now, when I was practicing last night, I realized, geez, I missed a misprint on California. That's not an increase in employment of almost 7 million. The 6 shouldn't be there. It's 965,000. Those are the annual employment gains by state in October, and the BLS, the percentage increase, and the unemployment rate. What I think is sort of interesting, looking at this, gives you an idea of the continued gains, the rates of increase in employment in the different states, and look at the unemployment rates. Okay, in many cases very, very low. In many cases under 3%. Illinois up there at 4.6, but a lot of the states, relatively tight labor markets. It shows up in the unemployment rate, as well as the employment growth. So where are we going? Okay, at least a slowdown, probably a recession. This year output on an annual basis will be somewhere in the 1% and 2%. You had no growth in the first half of the year. You had that 2.9% annualized in the third. I think the fourth quarter will be up as well. It's going to be up, but well below the 5.9% that we had last year. Next year, I think very low. We're going to see a recession, growth likely to be in the 0 to 1%. Okay. The point is weakness. The consumer price index this year 7 to 8%, up from 4.7 last year. Next year, maybe 3.5 to 4. It's going to slow down. I'm assuming the tight monetary stuff, the weakening, is going to take a toll. We've already seen the headline numbers start down. I think it's very important to point out there is a high level of uncertainty. I would expect the people on this call probably obviously pay some attention to various forecasts and outlooks, and you can see stuff all over the place. The National Association of Business Economists, in their October forecast, the difference in the median forecast of the 5 highest and the 5 lowest was 3.1 percentage points. Now think about that in terms of 3.1 percentage points difference in the growth rates for output, and we're talking about growth rates that are very low. The November forecast, which just came out after I had sent this in, the forecast difference rose to 3.3%. So there is a lot of uncertainty. You can look at some major brokerage houses saying soft landing, others saying recession. It's going to be interesting to watch how the divided government plays out. The optimists, inflation expectations are well anchored. Okay, you saw the New York Fed data yesterday showed, expectations of declining inflation. It's not a financial crisis. You have tight labor markets, and in the tight labor markets, some people, rather than lay people off that they just had a heck of a time hiring, are going to hold on. Say, well, I'll figure out some way to keep these people on. The supply chain is improving. Commodity prices easing. Home prices and rents are softening, because one of the big elements of the Consumer Price Index was the housing section, and we're starting to see some softening there. It's going to take a long time to work through to the index. The recession camp, that rates are going to be higher longer. Wage growth rates have held up. You've got declining wealth, global weakness, continued tightening in monetary and fiscal policy. So they would emphasize those things. All right, let's do another polling question. The Federal Reserve has said yesterday that the increase in rates is not over, okay? And there's support for that on the board. When do you think they're going to start to lower the funds rate? Okay. All right. First half of 2024, see the most popular. Second half of 2024. Okay, not a lot of people think it's going to be in 2023, and some even 25 and beyond. Now, what's interesting about that is notice when the inflation data came out this week earlier, and it was below expectations. You had a big jump in the market. People thought, oh, the Fed's not, the Fed will be able to relax or pivot sooner. And I think the Fed's trying to make the point they're staying on this anti-inflation course. I don't think they're going to be anxious to reverse policy. Case. First half of 2024, ways to go. Well, in thinking about the economy and the outlook, the experience that we've been through, I keep coming back to the idea of a long shadow of COVID that is going to impact us for a long time. The labor force reduction, okay, I showed you earlier that the labor force, the participation rate is reduced compared to what we had prior to the start of the pandemic. It hasn't come back as some would have expected. Some of it's aging baby boomers. Some of it may be people thinking differently about life. Some of it the immigration stuff. But it plays a role, okay, in our long-term growth. I mean, how many Tom Brady's are out there, okay, that might come back, that people that have retired, maybe they'll get bored and come back. But it's going to impact our growth rate. It's going to impact your ability to hire. The supply chain reevaluation. For most of our lives, we've seen efforts to squeeze costs out of the system, move production to where it was least costly. Stuff might go across borders a number of times, reduce inventory. But now that process is being rethought. Now carrying more inventory, trying to develop alternative suppliers. Janet Yellen talks about friendshoring, locating things in countries that are friendly to us. There's a security emphasis. But what does that imply? That implies higher prices. You know, carry more inventory, it's going to cost more. Less globalization, or what we're saying is globalization to different areas, it implies higher costs. We're spending more time thinking about where stuff comes from. COVID demonstrated alternative business arrangements, alternative locational patterns. You know, in some of these other webcasts, we had large percentages of people who were working hybrid. Okay. We're probably not going to go back. What are the implications of that for downtown real estate, for real estate values? Going to be interesting to play out. We went through this period of broken agreements, forbearance, deferrals, rent holidays, payment suspensions. We're breaking deals. Okay, is that going to impact our willingness to make deals? Now, income without work, okay, or production. You got stimmies, unemployment count more than earnings, reduced work requirements. Some of those are still in effect. Things like the PPP program. You gave people money, but they didn't have to produce. What are the long-term implications of that? You know, as an economist, you know, you can't give away what you don't produce. Okay? The next shock, what's going to be the policy response? You know, if unemployment goes up substantially, we get a commodity shock or something, will there be, more stimmies or more PPP programs? You know, what have we set in motion? I don't know, but it's going to be interesting to watch. And I'm sure you all saw the material about educational disruption, the deterioration in performance for students. You know, national education, or national assessment of educational progress, that's going to be with them for the rest of their lives. Plus the war in Europe and the Chinese challenge. There's going to have to be a defense response atop the entitlements, a reorientation of trade in response to energy risk, protectionist policies, geopolitical conflict. Pretty exciting time. The question now is soft landing or hard. Well, my last slide. Let's go out 5 years. I'm not going to be doing this 5 years from now. But looking back, will the supply chain be able to respond to the new rules, you know, in terms of domestic sourcing? What's going to be the global response? You know, French President Macron visited with President Biden. Europe's very concerned about the protectionist stuff in the Inflation Reduction Act. How are other countries going to respond? You know, the new drug supply after drug price controls. That's been one of the long-term worries. We don't know. The industrial policy in the CHIPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. You know, is it going to give us the internet or is it going to give us Solandra? The size and role of government. The labor market, older, slower growing. How will you cope? And then what's the Fed's inflation target gonna be? Okay. Will they be able to get it back down to 2, or will they have to say, we'll stop at 4? And then, particularly given the answer to the earlier question, what are you going to be driving in 2030? Well, what I do at the end of the year, start of the year. I put my outlook in terms of a poem, and I will take a minute or two and do that. 21 saw output pass the pre-recession peak and continue its ascent. Employment rose 7 million. The unemployment rate fell to 3.9%. Inflation in January was 1.4%. By December through 7, it was passing. From quiescent to soaring, and younger generations were gasping. Energy and food shocks were nothing new. Pandemic distortions, supply chain disruptions, labor market withdrawals were additions to the stew. Trump's 900 billion, Joe's rescue plans trillions, and continued Fed ease were like Vietnam and Burns of an earlier episode. February 22 brought Russia's invasion, more price level shocks, and the post-Cold War order did implode. The Fed reacted in late 21, reducing QE, then let bonds run off, the balance sheet to erode. The Fed began raising rates in March, 25, 50, 475s, and a 50. Powell was like Volcker when into Jackson Hole he rode. A summer stock rally was a dead cat bounce as forecasts moved down. The yield curve inverted and the recession chorus has grown. Strong balance sheets, labor markets, and anchored inflation expectations support the soft landing prayer. Slow growth at a minimum with likely a recession in the air. Monetary policymakers are challenged with long and variable lags. Housing has turned down as affordability continues to sag. Asset prices are declining with rising rates, a wealth effect hit. Perhaps some will re-enter the labor force rather than sit. The end game in Ukraine is unknown, with echoes of Cuba in the distant past. The quest for natural gas around the globe is scrambling markets, creating winners, losers, and wealth transfers vast. Security is the watchword. Protectionism and industrial policy are currently in style. Price controls on drugs, subsidies for the favored, and a small red ripple. The ramifications of these will take a while. Thank you for your attention.
John, thank you. That was. It's always great. I don't know that I've heard your poem before, and I'm going to be looking forward to that in the future. Thank you very much. A lot of great insight there. We try have time for maybe one or two questions, John, if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay. I think you've answered most of these between some of your later comments as well as the poem that closes out there. But one that I don't know was maybe covered is just to get your thoughts on the bond market's reaction to the Fed's most recent rate hike and Chair Powell's comments following the meeting.
Well, when the notion that, I mean, you've seen, of course, after the meeting, the 10-year had gone up, but you've seen in recent weeks the inversion where the 10-year has come down below it was up over 4, and I don't know where it is this morning, is around in the 3.6 range. I mean, what that seems to be signaling is the expectation of a recession and the Fed reversing policy down the road. Now, this group thinks, and I tend to agree, that it's going to be in 2024. I mean, the bond market's going to react to the expectations of inflation, the expectations of Fed policy. The other thing we have to remember about the bond market is we have that quantitative tightening going on, where the Fed is not rolling over its securities.
Thank you. Well, I have us down about 30 seconds left, and so if we didn't get to all of your questions, if they weren't covered in John's later portion of his discussion, feel free to reach out. I did want to mention that some of you had technical difficulty with the last polling question. If you weren't able to answer it, we'll make sure to check that against the CPE tracking to make adjustments where necessary. So hopefully there won't be any issues there once we're all done. Again, thank you all for joining us today. Thank you, John. We always appreciate you joining us, and have a great holiday season.
Yep. Thank you.
All right, thank you all. And I do want to mention real quick that for those of you that did meet your CPE requirements, your certificate is available to download now in the CPE progress window. A copy will be emailed out within 2 weeks if you have difficulty downloading it now. And finally, here's a link to an online survey for today's presentation. And thank you for joining our webcast. We'll hope you join us again next time. Take care, everyone. Thank you, John. Thank you, Dustin.
Okay.